Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the second Sulgrave Seminar of the year. My name is Dr. Sam Edwards, and it's my pleasure to host this afternoon's proceedings. The Sulgrave Seminar Series is brought to you by Sulgrave Manor, the ancestral home of George Washington, first President of the United States. Sulgrave Manor is the original home of the US-UK special relationship, and our seminar series reflects this fact. Each seminar explores some of the connections and contrasts in US and UK culture and politics. And this year, the theme for our series is democracy. Our first seminar back in November, which you can view on YouTube, focused on the US and UK constitutions. Our second seminar today, this afternoon, turns its attention to US and UK electoral politics. To examine this subject, we have two noted experts. Dr. Clodagh Harrington is lecturer in politics at University College Cork and the author of a number of publications discussing the American political system, including a 2020 book with Edinburgh University Press focused on the transition from the presidency of Barack Obama to that of Donald Trump. Dr. Harrington has also provided expert commentary on various occasions to the BBC. And this afternoon, she'll be talking to us about US electoral politics. Dr. Stephen Hague, our second speaker, is an associate professor of European history at Rowan University across the pond in New Jersey. Dr. Hague works on Britain and its global engagement since the 18th century, with a special interest in the intersections of architecture, material culture, and political history. He is the author of The Gentleman's House in the British Atlantic World, published in 2015, and he is the co-editor of At Home in the 18th Century, published in 2022. Dr. Hague is a fellow of Lincoln College, Oxford, and he is also a trustee of Sulgrave Manor. He'll be talking to us today about UK electoral politics. Each seminar follows the same basic format. Each of our speakers will deliver a short presentation offering their thoughts on the subject at hand, electoral politics, after which I and they will have a bit of a conversation. We'll talk things through and develop some of the thoughts and commentary that they've offered. But this is not just about those of us on screen. And if you're tuning in this afternoon, then we also want to hear your thoughts, comments, and questions as well. And there'll be a point in proceedings where I'll draw this to your attention, and you can use the Q&A function on your webinar to ask that question about US and UK politics, because we've got the people here that hopefully can answer it. Without further ado, then, I'm going to get things underway. Our first speaker is Dr. Clodagh Harrington, and Dr. Harrington is going to talk to us about US electoral politics, voting in the US system. Dr. Harrington, the virtual floor is yours.
Great. Good afternoon, everybody. Just going to ensure that the technology all works here with my PowerPoint sharing. Just a moment. Okay, can we see that now?
Yeah, we've got you.
Yep. Excellent. Okay, great. Well, so greetings, everybody. I'm just going to put my notes to hand here. So I am delighted to be here. Thank you all so much for being present, and to Dr. Sam Edwards and colleagues for inviting myself and Dr. Hague. It's a pleasure. I'm actually speaking to you from Ireland at the moment, as was mentioned, where I've been teaching US history and politics at University College Cork for the past couple of years. So prior to that, I was associate professor of American politics at De Montfort University in the UK for 16 years or more, and during that time I was on the board of the UK American Politics Group for about 9 years. So I do have, I think, a pretty strong sense of awareness and sort of the history and significance of Sulgrave Manor, and the many decades of connections between the APG and Sulgrave, because we did a lot of work in tandem on the absolutely wonderful US Congress to Campus program and other similar events. So it's really a pleasure to participate in an event that promotes ties, shares knowledge, and reinforces transatlantic relationships. And so this feels like really quite an opportune moment to be talking about elections, parties and voting, that kind of thing, and democracy, which is actually what I ended up thinking about quite a bit today when I was preparing my notes for this. So obviously in the UK at the moment, there's local mayoral elections, imminent in a couple of days. I still follow things, even though I'm not actually physically present there anymore. And here in Ireland, we have elections coming up in June for local and EU level. I've thrown my own hat in the ring for a local council seat. So that's actually giving me a really meaningful set of insights from a candidate perspective, which is very interesting because I've been in the classroom for the bones of 20 years and always thinking about these things from an academic perspective. So I'm really enjoying that kind of practitioner or potential practitioner experience. So it's elections galore at the moment, but I think that the big one, I mean, especially if you're a fan of American politics, as so many people are, November 5th, 2024 is kind of, the big moment, really. I think really only those sort of sheltering very far away from any media input would have missed the fact that the US is facing an election rematch that apparently no one wanted. Little poll there from Reuters. This is one of a number, but I thought it was quite interesting, just as a reminder that apparently this is the rematch that nobody wanted, that of Biden versus Trump, or as one might very accurately point out, an 81-year-old incumbent versus a 77-year-old former president who, as it happens, faces a total of 91 felony charges. And on this very day, I think in court, has been charged with contempt of court for repeatedly violating a gag order in relation to trial events, witnesses, and the like. Anyway, so that's obviously quite a saga. So this Reuters poll here and a number of others similar to it in recent months have showed us that essentially the public are tired of seeing the same candidates, and they would prefer to see some new faces and characters. But we are where we are. So that said, that's kind of the scene set for now. I just wanted to take a step back, I suppose, and say a few things about the state of US democracy and the kind of the challenges that it's faced maybe in recent times, and then some observations about the kind of the mechanics of all the procedures. So I think there's been a lot of negative discourse in recent times about the state of American democracy. I think there's whatever side of the political fence you're on, I think this is a given. So there's all of that negativity, but I was thinking, what can I kind of focus on that's a bit more positive? And I was reminded, or I reminded myself, that on the positive side, there are more elections held in the US than in any other nation. Now, there are some issues around voter turnout and that kind of thing, which we'll talk about in a moment. But just in terms of the kind of the available democracy, if you like, there are approximately 535,000 electoral posts up for grabs, and this is everything from sheriff, dog catcher in some states, local and state judges, mayors, governors, legislators, vice president, president, all the way up the food chain, and so many more in between. So I think in terms of democratic access, I think the United States is, on paper at least, an absolute hive of democracy. Now, there are some important roadblocks to voting, and I am not dismissing or glossing over those, but I think it is important to note that the vast majority of people in the US do have access to the democratic processes. Now, also in preparation for this, I was looking at the most recent Economist Democracy Index, which is something that I use quite a lot with my students. And my students always find it quite fascinating to see that, I say to them, okay, there's 167 nations on this index. Where do you reckon, the United States is, or wherever? And they always tend to guess incorrectly. And where the US is in a ranking of 167 is at number 25. And it falls into the category of a flawed democracy. And I think that's just worth kind of noting for a moment. It actually ranks below Chile. It's just above Israel. But it's far below, it's many of its other Western counterparts, and there's all sorts of reasons for this: overlapping, evolving. Things like, as I mentioned a while ago, voter access, there's political polarization, spread of misinformation, disinformation, all of this kind of stuff. But the one thing that has come up in recent years, in terms of a key shortcoming, is the category of functioning of government, okay? And where it absolutely dips in the EDI index is from 2016 onwards. Now, you can cast your mind back to what happened in that rather significant year. And it's basically stayed in a lower category ever since. So I think these are quite significant issues for considerations. And it reminded me that there was this conversation back and forth on the campaign trail in in 2016, when there were sort of complaints about the kind of state of US democracy, etc. And Hillary Clinton, obviously one of the candidates at the time, made the statement that kind of made the headlines. She said, "We are not Denmark." And at the moment, it's actually Norway is number one in the EDI index. Back then, it was Denmark. And she says, "We are not Denmark, we are the United States." And so with that, and she went on to sort of explain that the kind of the character, the nature of US democracy and politics is really quite unique. Now, there's the kind of the exceptionalism aspect of that, which has its own controversies. But I think no matter what way you kind of look at it, historically speaking, the US has enjoyed a pretty early and ongoing stable political democracy, things like birthright citizenship. It's been kind of fortunate in that it didn't have kind of a historic feudal tradition, all of these kinds of other things that held European nations back. And so what it means is that in the 20th century, at least, and arguably still, it is, and what it was and is, a military and economic superpower. Now, I know that there has been, as Sam mentioned, a session in 2023 on the US Constitution. So I don't go back into that now in any great detail, but just a kind of a reminder, I suppose, for us that in the US, the constitutional framework for elections did a very sort of progressive and significant thing, that effort to blend the principle of popular sovereignty with a desire to restrict the power of those people governing the country. And I mean, I think all of us learn in school history class on both sides of the Atlantic, about the separation of powers, the system of checks and balances, and all the kind of the guardrails put in place to try and prevent a tyranny of the majority, or even just a tyranny. So that's the kind of the little dot of historical context. And then I was thinking of just sort of moving forward to kind of more present times and thinking about the election processes that are rolling out before us. At the moment, we're kind of in the middle of the presidential primary season. And I mean, these things actually get quite a lot of coverage on this side of the Atlantic as well, I think both in Ireland and the UK. An average person in the street would be mindful of maybe not the detail, but certainly the order of things. So there's the primary process that goes on for months. I think that will conclude in June. And then we have two conventions over the summer, Republicans in July and Democrats in August. And this is where state delegates will attend and vote to confirm their choice of candidates. Then, there's still more prior to November 5th. You have that series of presidential and one vice presidential debate in the autumn. And there will be tens and tens of millions of Americans will tune in. And actually, international observers and interested bods will tune in and watch those things as well. And I think then that takes us to the 5th of November, where an estimated 244 million Americans will be eligible to cast their vote. So just a couple of things, I suppose, to say about that. One is that it seems like an endless process. And, one might wonder, why does it have to be so long? And I think the answer normally, perhaps not this time around, is to do with the fact that it gives voters and the general public the opportunity to really get to know their candidates. And especially if these are, they might be newcomers, they might not have the kind of brand recognition of others. And that kind of slow percolation and that slow burn and that continued exposure means the public get a sense of who these individuals actually are. And this helps to explain the kind of the reported boredom, if you like, of the public, because Joe Biden's been in public life for more than half a century. Donald Trump has been around forever in various forms, a businessman, a reality television star, etc., etc. So the public kind of feel there's not much more to learn. So there is that. And the other thing, I think, as I briefly mentioned a while ago, is that voter turnout is an issue. Okay, sometimes it's better than others, but broadly speaking, turnout tends to be about 2/3 of eligible voters, which for a Western democracy is actually really quite low. And there is some speculation, perhaps, that voter turnout won't be that high in November because people are, well, as I said, a bit tired of seeing the same faces. Oh yeah, I have a little. Oh, my slides are stuck, but Oh yeah, there's my sort of visual reminder of kind of how split the nation is, I suppose, down the middle. And the other thing that I think is worth a mention briefly is, again, and polls bear this out, is that, you know, a lot of voters would hold a lot of those in public office in relatively low regard, not so much the presidential incumbent or candidates, but Congress. When you look at polling data in relation to public support for Congress, it tends to be phenomenally low. And that quote there from Mark Twain, which is obviously, you know, going back some time, it's kind of an oldie but a goodie, in the sense that it's amusing, it's derogatory, but I think it still stands pretty much now as much as it ever did. And the downside of that then is that people feel that, you know, they're not necessarily being represented sufficiently. So at the moment, you have the kind of the lead up to the two sets of congressional elections that are going to take place also in November. I won't go into the details of those now, but just basically, we kind of know that the lower house is the kind of more populist, kind of fast and furious two-term setup in the House of Representatives. It's popular, it's populist, it's close to the political ground, and it is very much constantly beholden, I think, to voters, because as soon as candidates are elected, they have to start thinking about the next election again. The Senate, on the other hand, is a little bit more calm, I suppose might be the word. At any given time, only 1/3 of Senate seats are up for grabs. And so the logic of this partial change is to sort of ensure continuity and yeah, just not that same kind of populist feeling, I think. How am I doing for time? Okay, I have quite a few more things to say, but I think I'll leave a lot of them, and maybe they will just come up more naturally in the Q&A session. I'll just skip to the next point I wanted to make here, of how things have kind of evolved in terms of the political process, and the kind of political civility have taken an enormous beating in recent years. I think everyone is mindful of that. And there's a couple of quotes there that I think, for me, really just encapsulate this quite starkly. The first there is from John Wayne. Those of you older audience members may know who he is. He would not have been a fan of President Kennedy, let's put it that way. But when JFK actually won the election in 1960, the quote from John Wayne was, "I didn't vote for him, but he's my president, and I hope he does a good job." So, you know, there's a kind of a politeness and a humanity and a kind of a civility to that. And then we fast forward to 2008, and we have radio host Rush Limbaugh on the Obama election, and he just basically says, "I hope he fails." So, you know, that's a little snapshot of where things have gone in terms of political civility. And I think that's a very worrying thing. Now, this next slide, I think, is probably something for perhaps the Q&A afterwards. It's just to note that there have been culture wars issues for decades, really decades, you know, arguably back to the 1960s, but they have evolved in recent times in a way that one mightn't have anticipated, onto what I would kind of call the harder end of things, like the economy, foreign policy, that kind of thing, where you wouldn't have seen that previously. And then just finally, to conclude, I would say that the US has always been a center-right nation. It is now genuinely split down the middle. You have these very kind of unhelpful and crass categorizations. You have a lack of nuance, and everybody kind of in their silos, which is not a good or healthy place to be. And I think the final point there I wanted to make is that, you know, in 2020, what we saw, even though obviously Joe Biden won the election, was that the Donald Trump phenomenon and the Donald Trump single term was in no way an aberration, because half of the country voted for him and absolutely unequivocally wanted him to serve a second term or another term. And I'll say a few more things perhaps in the Q&A if it comes up, about what a second Trump term would look like, because that's what I'm writing on at the moment. But right now I'll stop, because I've had my time, and thank you so much everybody for listening.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Harrington. Lots of food for thought there that, as you say, hopefully we can pick up in our conversation that follows in a short while's time, and also in the Q&A. So if Dr. Harrington has got you thinking and you want to ask us some questions, then absolutely make sure you do so in a short moment's time. First up, though, we have to hear from our second speaker, and our second speaker is Dr. Stephen Hague, and Dr. Hague is going to be talking to us about the converse now. We're going to be talking about UK electoral politics. So, Dr. Hague, once again, the virtual floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Sam. Really interesting to hear about the American side of politics, and I hope I can offer some observations about the British side and the British electoral system. So in the next kind of 15-20 minutes or so, I'd like to do two things. First, I'd like to talk about some of the fundamentals of the British electoral system, and I'll as Clodagh did, I'll be focusing on the impending, we think, general election in the UK, rather than regional or the local and mayoral elections, which are taking place on Thursday, although certainly they may come up in the Q&A. Secondly, I would like to, I hope, offer something of an outside perspective from America about what seems curious or interesting, different, even maybe occasionally bizarre about the British system in comparison with American politics. So I would like to frame my discussion and my remarks today around two deaths, which doesn't sound isn't as morbid as it sounds. 2 decades. I do want to take a little bit of an historical perspective on things, and finish up very briefly with 3 key moments that I think resonate for many Americans watching the British system in operation. So I've been thinking quite a lot about British politics. They've been on my mind lately, not only because of the seminar today, but also because of the death 2 months ago of this fellow Patrick Cormack, the long-serving member of Parliament in the British House of Commons, and latterly Lord Cormack when he went to the House of Lords. Although Patrick Cormack was never a leading figure in British politics, he was a devoted parliamentarian, believed deeply in the centrality of Parliament to British political life. He was a One Nation conservative who was first elected to the House of Commons in 1970 and remained engaged in politics right up until the time of his death. And the reason why I bring him up is because as a 20-year-old American undergraduate studying in London, I first developed a keen interest in and gained an exposure to British politics as research assistant to Patrick Cormack. For a brief 6 months, I worked in the Palace of Westminster, which was, I have to say, a formative experience that in many ways inspired my studies, but also my subsequent professional life. Now I try to teach and make sense of British history and politics to American students who generally feel some sort of indefinable affinity with Britain, but never cease to be fascinated or confused, sometimes bemused by the British system. So when something noteworthy happens in the UK, my classes are often derailed with detailed questions and discussion about the parliamentary system. And this brings me to my second death, that of the Queen in September of 2022. The Queen's death occurred on the very first day of our fall semester of classes here at the university where I am. I was teaching a course on Europe since 1945, and it was lost on neither myself nor my students that the Queen's reign stretched back very nearly to the beginning of the period that we were going to be studying that semester. And so students coming to class that very first day had queries about the monarchy, about the power of the king, who would be coming, who would be taking the throne, and what role the monarchy plays in politics. So, following swiftly on the heels of a new prime minister taking office, it seemed a very heady time for British politics on an American campus. The questions continued to mount, I have to say, when my students became fascinated by the internet sensation of Liz Truss and the famous head of iceberg lettuce that many on this Zoom will remember. This sort of serio-comical episode raised further issues for my students about the nature of the prime minister, how they were elected or get into office, and what mechanisms enable them to be changed, as well as just the British government more generally. Rarely, I have to say, in my experience, has a vegetable been so welcome to young people and such a good teaching tool. So I think these episodes raise some of the questions I would like to address today. And I don't want to kind of rehash the structure of the British government just very briefly. As we know, the UK Parliament made up of two houses: the popularly elected House of Commons and the appointed House of Lords, which serves as an advisory check. The majority party in the House of Commons is the one responsible for forming the government. And so in this way, a difference between the American and the British systems, very profound difference, is that the legislative and executive functions are combined in Parliament. I want to say just a little bit about the political party realignment and the sort of mapping of the political parties, because I think this is another instance where Americans are very interested in the in the political system. If we look back to the late 19th century, there was a fairly clear right-left divide. Anchored on the left, the British political system, by the Liberal Party, and on the right by the Conservatives or by the Tories. Just about 100 years ago, this the sort of what I would characterize as the modern form of the political party arrangement in Britain came into being with the Labour Party, which emerged as a working class party, party of trade unions, becoming the primary party of the left in Britain. The Liberals still a small party in the center left, and then the Conservatives on the right. And I want to talk about this over the course of the last century or so, because there's been remarkable stability in terms of the main political parties, but a lot of variation in their in their development. And so the first decade that I want to look at is the decade between 1929 and about 1940. And this is by way of taking an historical look at some of the fairly dramatic ebbs and flows of the British political system. 1929 was an election year, what is very often referred to as the flapper election. It was the first election where women under the age of 30 could vote. It was the first election conducted on the basis of universal suffrage in Britain. And the result was what is called a hung parliament, where no party achieved an overall majority. The Labour Party, however, this relatively newcomer to the political left, did form the government under the leadership of Ramsay MacDonald, but was very quickly confronted with the catastrophe of the Great Depression, which affected not only Britain, of course, but global economics. Within a couple of years, it was seen necessary to, in response to economic crises, Britain having to go off the gold standard, to form a national government. In other words, a number of different parties coming together to unite in governing the country in this considerable period of crisis. Once the national government was formed, it went to the country to a popular vote, to an election, and that election, if you look at the bar graph in on the upper part of the slide, is the peak of the Conservative Party vote. In fact, 1931 was the last time in British political history that one party secured a majority of the vote. The Conservatives achieved over 50%. But they remained part of the national government, working with Ramsay MacDonald, the Labour politician who continued as prime minister. And this was effectively the arrangement throughout the 1930s. Ramsay MacDonald was later replaced by the sort of avuncular kind of Middle England conservative leader Stanley Baldwin, who became prime minister in 1935. And then also took the national government to the British people, where it was reelected. The Conservatives saw a slight reduction in their vote, an uptick in the vote for the Labour Party. But what's interesting about this particular government elected in or this parliament elected in 1935 is that it was the last election to take place in the UK until the end of the Second World War. The Parliament sat for 10 years, from 1935 to 1945. Over the course of time, however, Stanley Baldwin retired as Prime Minister to be replaced by Neville Chamberlain. Neville Chamberlain, as many will know, replaced in the early first year of the Second World War by Winston Churchill. All national governments or war coalition governments, parties working together. But the suspension of general elections for a decade is very different from what was the case in America, where despite the Great Depression and the Second World War, the regularity of American elections continued with presidential elections in 1936, 1940, and in 1944, when President Roosevelt was elected to an unprecedented fourth term in office. So I just want to jump ahead then to consider the second decade, and this may be more recent politics that are somewhat more familiar to those on the seminar, and to trace a little bit leading up to where British politics are in 2024. So the last sort of period of time since 2010, an election which brought a conservative and liberal Democrat coalition to government, followed by another legislatively mandated election in 2015 that, to many people's surprise, resulted in an overall conservative, small, but an overall conservative majority. And if you again look at the bar graph, you can see between 2010, when the Liberal Democrats commanded about 20% of the popular vote, their efforts at coalition with the Conservatives resulted in a precipitous decline in their support and an enormous reduction in their in the number of seats that the Liberals held. This was followed by the referendum on Brexit, and I pause here to simply make note of how dramatically the Brexit referendum did influence British politics. It dominated politics for very largely for the remainder of the 2000 teens decade. And it's also something that's somewhat difficult to understand, I think, in the context of American politics. A referendum like this on a single issue with, in effect, an up or down, leave or remain vote is something that's highly unusual. Although some comparisons have been drawn with the every 4-year vote for the U.S. president, as Clodagh made mention of. It seems pretty clear that nobody likes the choice that Americans are faced with in November of 2024 between President Biden and former President Trump. But at the same time, they will need to make a choice between those two candidates. In effect, an up or down referendum on the sitting president. Following on from the Brexit referendum, much of the political workings out of Parliament, what it was engaged with, was the results of the Brexit referendum. There was another election in 2017 that resulted, not as expected, in a somewhat larger conservative majority in order to accomplish Brexit, but in fact a hung parliament where the Conservatives were still in power. And then finally in 2019, on Boris Johnson's fairly dramatic victory, brought a Conservative majority of about 80 to Parliament on the promise of getting Brexit done. So just a few observations about this, I think, related to the political system. And I think it's interesting to look at the map of British constituencies, those 650 constituencies that elect individual MPs. In 2017, if you look in the north of England, lots and lots of red, the so-called red wall that's of Labour support. That was what largely collapsed in the map on the left, the 2019 map. Boris Johnson and the Conservatives made dramatic inroads. So there's a lot more blue in the north of England. And these so-called red wall seats remain seats that are much contested and much discussed in the context of the British politics and the election expected this year. Another point that I think is relevant to be made in comparison to American politics is that Britain, despite being dominated largely by Conservatives and Labour as the two largest parties for the last century or so, Britain is very much a multi-party system. There are a number of political parties that have some level of representation in Parliament. This is very different from the American system, where there is almost no representation at any level outside of the Republican and Democratic parties. And so these numbers are a little bit out of date. The Conservative seats in government is down, I think, by about a dozen from the figure shown here. But the Conservatives are the main party of the right, but on the left, the Labour Party, the Liberal Democratic Party, very often kind of vie for support. In the current Parliament, the Scottish National Party has a substantial number of seats, of course, very much concentrated in Scotland. And some of this is a factor of something that's a little bit more familiar, I think, to Americans, the first past the post system. In each constituency, the candidate who secures the largest number of votes is elected. And what this produces, in effect, is a system where, in this instance, if we look at the Liberal Democrats, who in 2019 secured 11% of the vote, only secured 11 seats because of the distribution of their support. Labour had 20 percentage points more of a vote, but secured 20 times the number of seats, and the Conservatives, with 43% of the vote, secured a considerable majority in what was considered a landslide election. So the closest comparison, I think, here in the American context is this ongoing discussion about the United States electoral college, which technically does elect the president. It was much in issue and debated in particularly in 2020. So the number of states won by individual candidates determines who's going to be president through the electoral college rather than the popular vote, which has been won in all but one election over the last 30 years by the Democratic candidate. So another factor that I think is intriguing to Americans is the context of changing prime ministers. How often political leadership does change in the UK or can change. And this is going to be, I think, something we'll be talking about more in our final Sulgrave seminar. But it's nothing short of bewildering in many ways, I think, to Americans to consider that 5 different prime ministers will have served over the course of the last 8 years. David Cameron, Theresa May, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, and Rishi Sunak. Actually, you had 3 prime ministers in office over the course of a couple of months, and this is just something that I think Americans find quite extraordinary. The way that political change can happen, particularly in terms of political leadership. So just in the those are a few observations about a couple of different decades and kind of political practice. I just want to quickly conclude with a couple of key moments that I think also strike viewers here on the American side of the Atlantic as interesting and intriguing. First is the time-honored tradition of Prime Minister's Question Time, which is actually aired on American television. If you want to watch it, I think Americans find it nothing short of extraordinary that the leader of the government has to go every week into the legislative assembly and answer for the policies of their government. This is something that Americans sort of think about with Joe Biden or Donald Trump going in and having to answer questions like this on a weekly basis as almost unfathomable. I think another instance, and this came up in 2019 when I was watching British election returns with some of my students, is the sort of direct, simplistic, almost ruthless accountability at times of the British system. That when the returning officer in each individual constituency lines up the candidates, they have to stand and hear the numbers of votes read out to see who is going to be elected the candidate. So this is a very poor image, but of a very famous event in British political history, what has come to be referred to as the Portillo moment from 1997, when Michael Portillo, a leading conservative, widely touted as probably being the next leader of the Conservative Party, was defeated in the 1997 election. And the Portillo moment is something referenced quite frequently, and there are already projections about how many Portillo moments there may be in 2024. I think thirdly and finally, in terms of a moment that strikes Americans, is the rapidity with which governments and prime ministers can change. As we 2020, there's very long, rather laborious turnover of government in the United States, whereas it happens seemingly almost instantaneously. The monarch calls for a leader of a political party to come to Buckingham Palace, and almost magically, 10 Downing Street is ready for them to return if they've been asked to form a government. So the sort of removal van in Downing Street is something that I think is a source of great fascination for Americans. As far as 2024 and what happens with that, I think I will just end by saying that historians are not particularly good sometimes at analyzing the past, and they should probably not be in the business of predicting the future. So it's perhaps best left to others to weigh in on what is likely to happen when the general election takes place in 2024. At the moment, I think polling suggests a fairly significant Labour majority, likely to gain over 400 seats in the House of Commons, but all remains to be seen. And so, as Clodagh said about the American election cycle, it is an endless process. I think one of the things that Americans look on with some envy is that the British general elections take place literally over the course of a month. Another one of those salient features of difference between American and British political systems. Thanks very much, and I'll look forward to the question and answers. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you very much for that presentation there, Dr. Hague. And what struck me listening to both of your presentations, Dr. Harrington and Dr. Hague, was first I love the fact that we've got you on either side of the Atlantic, and you're casting your gaze back and trying to make sense of how things are operating and working the other side. And if I had sort of one sort of takeaway from what both of you said there, it was kind of, I guess, that our relative political systems make sense to each other until they don't, and that was kind of my takeaway there. Let's see if we can explore a little bit of this in some more detail now for the final 15 minutes or so today. As we're talking, if you're tuning in, please do throw your questions our way, despite what Dr. Hague said there in his very final slide, which you'll see was a skillful attempt to avoid having to make a call on what was about to happen. Do feel free to push them, because they might be able to offer some hot takes here. Let's see what they come up with for us. Okay, let's have a little bit of a talk here. Clodagh, if I may, I'm going to come to you first. And what I was struck in both your presentations was you were talking about how things are changing, right? And how things are changing and how they've been changing over a period of time. Stephen there was taking things back to the early part of the 20th century. But I was really struck by the quote you offered us from John Wayne there in 1960. And I just wondered, Clodagh, when would you mark the beginning of the kind of the changes in US politics that you were talking about now? Is it going back to the 60s? Is it of the last decade or so? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, good question. Okay, so arguably back to the 1960s, but I think if I were to really land it perhaps more meaningfully, I would say it goes back to the 1990s. And this is, and then there were strands, I suppose. If I think of the Clinton era, that's when, for me, all of this became really very toxic. And I suppose there's a couple of things there. One is that that is the era that the internet arrived, if you like. So obviously pre-social media, but I'm thinking things like, the Drudge Report, that kind of thing. They were unprecedented, and you had this kind of a period where the kind of evolution from news that is fit to print as used to be the kind of the standard of the broadsheets, if you like, it just evolved down into the kind of the as we thought then, the murky sores of the internet, not knowing of course how much worse it was going to get. But certainly those Clinton years, I think it got very unpleasant, very toxic. And the second thing that was a real benchmark for me in that period is that Hillary Clinton was arguably the first of the first ladies to, really have a kind of a high level career of her own, not to detract from previous first ladies' achievements, but she was kind of postgraduate educated. She kept her maiden name as it was, all of these kinds of things. So this is when I think it starts getting really personal, and that whole move towards or move away from I disagree with you, but I respect you as a fellow human, to I disagree with you and I'm going to make personal comments about you, your wife, your life, everything else. So I think it started going downhill then, and it's just gotten worse since. And as media has become new media, social media, relentless media, we're kind of in a pit now. I don't quite know how we can get out.
Stephen, do you think it's, sorry, Stephen, yeah, go for it.
No, I was just going to weigh in. I think, I think Clodagh is right on it. And that, it's difficult to kind of pick a moment, but the 1990s, I think, are that time. I think if there is a moment, a lot of people would point to the midterm elections in 1994, the Contract for America, Newt Gingrich, right? This bombastic, bomb-throwing, legislator who I think really did change the tone. So I think, Clodagh very good sort of John Wayne quote and Rush Limbaugh quote. I think actually really sums it up. I mean, Rush Limbaugh in the 1990s, very much kind of the darling of that kind of end of the political spectrum. So.
Do you think, Stephen, could you identify similar impact of internet and social media in UK politics in terms of, I guess we're talking a little bit here about the kind of the polarizing that we've seen over the last 10, 15 years. So is it the 90s? Is it later in the UK system?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's difficult to say, and I would say, and I'm not sure whether whether you, Sam, or Clodagh would agree. I think that despite the polarization in British politics, right, particularly the question about Brexit, I think from the American perspective that the polarization still seems less pronounced. Right. The fact that in 2010, the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats could put together a functioning, aside from what it did and your views on that, could put together a functioning government, right, that lasted for 5 years. I'm not sure that anybody would have expected that. Brexit was obviously deeply divisive, deeply polarizing, and yet I think the British system, once it was sort of Brexit, once Brexit got done, I think that there's a sense that that perhaps politics will maybe resume some sort of normality. So not sure if you'd agree with that, but certainly I think in terms of in a comparative sense, it feels to me like the polarization is deeper, in America.
On a linked subject, obviously we've got a question here from William. So thank you for your question, William. I think this is to you, Clodagh, but I'm interested in your take as well, Stephen, in due course. And William's question is, do you believe that the American electoral system tends to favour populist candidates, or was Donald Trump's election due to an evolution in popular voting behaviours? Is there something distinct here about the American vote, the American system, do you think?
Good question. Perhaps I think, I suppose there's a couple of traits maybe within the system that would particularly lend themselves to somebody like a character like Trump ending up, in the Oval Office as he did. I suppose in particular, going back to what I said earlier about the kind of the evolution of the process, you're sort of on display, if you like, for a full 2 years, and if you are fortunate enough, as he was, to have the kind of prior decades of brand recognition that others could only have dreamt of, from his TV career and other, business achievements, etc. He had the kind of the capacity to almost play with the system, if you like, in terms of, engaging with the process, enjoying the stump speech element of things, the rallies, the debates. They were so up his street. And I remember doing an event in London just after he'd won, actually, in 2016. And one of my fellow panelists was a journalist, and he just literally had come from the airport an hour earlier. So it was very kind of exciting because he had all the kind of inside scoop. And he, whilst so many in the audience were kind of, very critical of Trump and what he might be bringing to the table, if you like, this particular journalist said, you can't understand Trump unless you attend one of his rallies. And if you're there, it's like, it's like if you're he didn't make this comparison, but the way I would see it is, if you're a Swiftie and you're at a Taylor Swift concert, this kind of thing, it's all consuming. everything he says. You're hanging off his every word. And he said, this is absolutely captivating. And for those of us at a bit of a distance or just reading about things in the broadsheets or whatever, we're never going to get that sense. So I think the system in the US really allows for that charismatic individual to absolutely excel in a way that the British system, I think, doesn't have that. I personally maybe think that's a better way to go. But I would think with the right character, you can certainly have an absolute ball with the way things are set up in the US.
That's a really interesting point. And it made me think of, Stephen, what you were talking about in your presentation about Prime Minister question times. Does a populist candidate who is a great rallier, do they survive in PMQs? It's not a format for them.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, I mean, the closest I think we can come is Boris Johnson, right? Who very much picked up a populist line, but I think there are a lot of comparisons drawn between Donald Trump and Boris Johnson. I think some of those comparisons are, I think, overdrawn, and I think Boris Johnson was a very different politician, a very different political populist, as it were, than Donald Trump was. I do think that the kind of the mechanics of the parliamentary system make it more difficult for somebody like that to gain and then retain power. Of course, it's also a useful reminder that even Donald Trump's first election was very, very narrow. But again, there is a very, very strong vein of populism at the moment in the United States. But that has ebbed and flowed over the course of time, right? There have been populists before.
Yeah. We've got another question from Visant, and if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly there, my apologies. But the question is, if the need arose, where do you think it would be easier to form a national government, in the UK or the US system? Stephen, do you want to take that first, then I'll come to you, Chloe. Where is it easier to form a national government?
Yeah, no, well, I mean, I think that it's a slightly tricky question. I mean, I would say in the UK, right, we have seen national governments form. We saw a coalition from 2010 to 2015. I think that it's reasonable to say that one of the missteps, even about Brexit, was that that there wasn't some sort of all-party committee or something that was put together to enable Brexit to happen in a more orderly fashion than it did. I think in America, of course, the discussion isn't so much about national governments; it is about bipartisanship. And there have been some bipartisan achievements in terms of particularly legislation. Traditionally, bipartisanship was to be found in foreign affairs to a large degree in American foreign policy. That's gone away somewhat. So yes, if I had to pick one, I would say the UK. The parliamentary system would be better suited for that.
What do you think, Clodagh? What do you think?
I think I agree with Stephen, actually. The US setup is it's very attractive in many ways, and I think there's kind of a lot to be said for it, and I tried to highlight that in my comments earlier, focusing on the positives, but I think essentially the UK version is more viable, I think, in this regard.
I'm conscious of time, both, but before I wrap things up and let you take your break, I think we're going to ask the question, right? We're going to ask that biggie, and I'm going to have to push you both. I want you to call it for me. Clodagh, call the American election for me. What do you think's happening?
Oh my goodness! I looked at a poll this morning. I think there was half a percentage point between the two candidates in that particular one. So it is really a kind of a crystal ball kind of situation. I feel that Biden will get it by a hair's breadth. But obviously, I mean, it's a long time till next November. But if I had to put 50 quid in it right now, I would say Biden, but barely. And Trumpism will not go away just because Donald Trump does not win. I think that is hugely important.
Yeah, I gave you the short straw there. That's the tough one to call. I mean, Stephen, I'll come to you though, but just about.
I was going to say, clearly I had much more difficult time on that. I don't think it's a big ask to, on the British side. I mean, almost everything. I think, kind of in terms of projections and polling. I think one projection I saw was there's sort of like a 99% certainty that Labour will secure a majority. It's really almost more of a question as how big is the majority? Is it 450? Is it 500 seats? How much of a drubbing do the Conservatives take? Anything can change. But I think it seems to be almost as close to guaranteed as one can get to be able to pick a Labour. So if I had Clodagh's 50 quid, I would definitely put it on a Labour majority.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that. So you heard it here first, everybody. We've just had 2 elections called there. We'll see what happens come November, and we'll see what happens come the election that we don't know quite yet when it's going to happen. Many thanks, everybody, for joining us this afternoon for 2 such interesting and timely presentations and talks there. And thanks as well for those of you who pitched in with your questions. Hopefully you found it engaging and useful and enjoyable, and it'll give you some nice kind of information and background and context to help you better understand what's going to be happening in November and in the other election when we find out when that's going to take place. Before drawing things to a close, just 3 things to say. First, my thanks once again to our speakers, Dr. Harrington and Dr. Hague, and thanks as well to my colleagues at Sulgrave, especially to Gemma Tomlin and to Alison Fell for making this possible. Second, I'd like to say, hopefully you've clocked the QR code that's been lingering around on your screen. If you are happy to donate to us, please do offer a donation. And if you think of that after the presentation is done, then you can also find details about how to donate to Sulgrave Manor on our website, and do take that opportunity if you feel so inclined. Finally, the last thing I'd like to say is that we hope you'll be able to join us for our 3rd and final free digital online seminar of this year's Sulgrave Seminar Series. It's going to happen in the summer, exact date to be confirmed, details to follow shortly. And our focus in this seminar, as Stephen hinted at one point in his presentation, will be on US and UK political leadership. That is, we're going to be talking about presidents and prime ministers. Hope you can join us for that. See you all then. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.